Welcome to today's session, Helping Economically Distressed Regions with Professor Gordon Hanson. Gordon is the Peter Wertheim Professor in Urban Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and co-editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. In his scholarship, Gordon specializes in international trade, international migration, and economic geography. His current research addresses how globalization in the form of immigration and expanded trade with China have affected US local labor markets. In a new endeavor, he is working with a multidisciplinary team of scholars to use satellite imagery to assess the impacts of expanding transportation networks, exposure to extreme weather, and related events on urban economic activity. Thank you for joining us today, Gordon. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'm delighted to share what we're doing at the Kennedy School on helping distressed regions with you. And I want to start with a note of humility. I'll be talking about what we know about the causes of regional economic distress, and then moving on to talk about what we can do about it. The note of humility comes in that there is much we don't know. Helping in this regard, here at the Kennedy School, we're starting a major new project on how we think about inventive solutions to regional economic distress. And very helpful to us in this process have been many Kennedy School graduates who are involved in state and local economic development in their communities. So what I want to talk about is the challenge of closing regional economic divides. The big motivation for this comes from the fact that it's gotten harder if you don't have a college education to make it into the middle class. I apologize that this slide I'm showing you of what a middle class lifestyle entails is contains some hopeless cliches. Traditionally, we think of that as earning a sufficient income where you can own your own home, own your own car, send your kids to college, and afford some luxuries like an annual family vacation. For much of the second half of the 20th century, this was possible for large segments of the US labor force, as it was in much of Europe. That's changed. There's been some major developments in global labor markets, which have worked strongly against those who don't have a college education or an advanced degree. So thinking about what happened between 1980 and 2019, before the onset of COVID, two big developments when we think about what was going on with workers. One was something we're now very familiar with, and that's increases in income inequality. This takes several dimensions, the most important being that the reward to having a higher education has gone up dramatically over the past few decades. It's gone up even more for those with training in science, technology, engineering, and math, and interestingly, those with strong social skills. While income has been rising overall, we've seen a plateauing in the fraction of workers who succeed in obtaining a college degree. So just as going to college has become more valuable, we found it difficult in the US and many other countries to get more than about 35 or 40% of adults through a BA degree. So as we think about solutions to creating economic opportunity, it's going to have to focus on not doubling, say, the college attainment rate, but increasing opportunities for those without college. What we've also seen is that earlier progress in the 70s and 80s and a little bit into the 90s in closing pay gaps between men and women, between whites and blacks in the United States has stalled. So the dimensions of inequality are present whether we look at workers divided by education, divided by gender, divided by race and ethnicity. An important dimension of the greater income inequality has been the fact that there's increasing differences across regions in economic opportunity. Highly educated workers, those who are earning higher incomes, are increasingly concentrated in a small set of superstar cities in the US, located primarily on the East and West coasts. But we see this across countries. It's true in Europe, concentration in London, in Paris, in Stuttgart and Munich. It's true in emerging economies as well. The concentration of the higher educated in Shanghai and Beijing in China, in Mexico City in Mexico, in Sao Paulo in Brazil. In addition to that concentration of higher skilled workers in particular places, we've seen substantial job loss in traditional industries, manufacturing, fossil fuels, other industries that paid workers without a college education and income significant enough to get them into the middle class. And the accumulation of these trends has been widening regional economic divides. And what I mean by that is that the economic opportunity available to you is more circumscribed by your place than it has been in decades in the US and other countries. So to give you just some sense of what this looks like, this map plots the change in the employment rate for the working age population over the last 30 years. What is the employment rate? It's the share of people with a job in the total working age population. It's different than the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the fraction of workers who don't have a job and are looking for work. So the employment rate measures the number of people with a job, the remainder of which is people who are unemployed and people who have just left the labor force in its entirety, which is a much larger group than the unemployed on their own. And what you see in the dark blue colors is the concentration of this job loss in parts of the United States that were historically specialized in manufacturing and fossil fuels. So what I'd like to talk to you about is first, the consequences of joblessness. And we'll be looking at what's happened as there's been technological change, globalization, and now an energy transition, which is moving the US away from historically gas, oil, and coal dependent industries, and what this has meant for local economic opportunity. Then what we'll do is talk about what we do about it. So we now have abundant evidence that as we think about economic change, that economic change has positive sides, moving into new and exciting industries that are innovative and that pay high wages and create opportunity for workers coming out of college or high school. But that economic change also has a downside. It means the turn away from traditional industries. As the US and other high-income countries have moved away from manufacturing over the last couple of decades, the consequences of that structural change has been concentrated job loss in regions that historically were specialized in manufacturing. And your first response might be to this, well, over the course of decades, market economies have adjusted to changes in economic conditions by moving labor between sectors, by moving labor between regions. What's the big deal? What we've observed over the past few decades is a substantial decline in the mobility of labor between regions. So what this has meant in places that were specialized in making furniture or textiles or other labor-intensive manufactured goods, when factories closed that produced those products, the outcome was job loss and the absence of local economic opportunity. And because workers weren't moving, the net result was a concentrated joblessness. So the big surprise to those of us who've been studying the developments in labor markets in the US and Europe is the absence of the mobility between regions, especially among those without a college education, as a means of adjusting to economic change. The consequence of this absence of labor mobility has been dire. So this is a proximate cause of increased inequality and economic opportunity across locations. It means a spatial misallocation of resources. We've got workers trapped in places where there just aren't jobs. It has contributed to the opioid crisis and so-called deaths of despair. And it's led to substantial political repercussions. In particular, what you can think of as the political revolt of the left behind, who have sought succor from populist and nationalist politicians in the US, UK, France, and Germany. So I want to talk about two episodes in which we've observed concentrated job loss, just to highlight the fact that places that have seen a disappearance of traditional industries have endured this change for different reasons, but there's a strong commonality in what has happened on the ground. And that commonality means when we think about policy solutions, we can think about common sets of solutions for places that today find themselves in distress. My own work over the last 10 years has focused on trying to understand what are the consequences of manufacturing job loss in communities that have been beset by increased global competition. So if you think about what happened in the economic geography of the United States, as well as in Europe after 1950, what we saw was manufacturing jobs, which had been concentrated in large cities, in places like Chicago and Cleveland and New York and Boston, move into smaller and medium-sized towns in the Midwest and the Southeast. We saw something similar happen in Great Britain, where manufacturing jobs left London and went to the north. We saw equivalent movements in Germany and France. What that meant is that by the time we get to 1980 or 1990, most manufacturing jobs are not in the big cities. The places that are really specialized in manufacturing are those in these smaller and medium-sized towns. Several events have really upset manufacturing. One of them has been the continual process of technological change, which through automation has meant that we can produce the same amount of manufacturing goods with many fewer workers. But there's also been the process of globalization. So what globalization has meant is increased participation in the global economy by a much wider range of countries. China's joining the global economy in the 1980s and 1990s was perhaps the most momentous change. Now, China opening its economy did incredible things for the global economy. In China itself, it lifted several hundred million people out of poverty. China's demand for resources led to resource booms in places like Australia and Brazil and Canada and South Africa. But because China was so specialized in manufacturing and because of its size and the rapidity with which it opened its economy, if you were specialized in making furniture or textiles or footwear in the 1990s or early 2000s, you saw a major disruption in your markets. Increased imports at lower prices caused many factories in the US and Europe to close. As those factories closed, what happened was the equivalent of local recessions. So I'm going to tell you the story about Martinsville, Virginia. Martinsville is a town in southwestern Virginia that exists in the furniture belt of the United States that stretches from the southern part of Virginia into North Carolina, Tennessee, and a bit of Kentucky. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Martinsville built its manufacturing base on two industries. One was furniture and one was textiles. The striking thing about this is that if you look in 1990, Martinsville was an industry town. 45% of its working age population was employed in manufacturing. These were primarily workers without anything beyond a high school education, and those manufacturing jobs allowed many of those workers to obtain the trappings of that middle-class lifestyle that we opened with. What happened, though, was as China joined the global economy and we saw dramatic increases in its exports of furniture and declining prices for furniture on world markets, factories in Martinsville closed. Over the ensuing 25 years, manufacturing employment in Martinsville plummeted. By 2016, the share of the working age employed in manufacturing in Martinsville fell from 45% to just 13%. So that's a over 30 percentage point drop. Conventional economic models would suggest to us that, well, fine, manufacturing jobs disappeared in Martinsville. People are just going to move away and find jobs elsewhere. Maybe they'll go to Richmond, further east in Virginia. Maybe they'll go south to Charlotte or Raleigh or other cities that are expanding in the region. This was not what happened. By and large, the folks who had lost their jobs in manufacturing stayed put. Because of the decline in economic opportunity, what that meant was a loss in the ability to earn a gainful wage, and workers responded by exiting the labor force. The fraction of working age adults that had a job was a healthy 73% in Martinsville in 1990, and it dropped to just 53% by 2016. So this experience of regionally concentrated job loss morphing into endemic joblessness is something we've seen across smaller and medium-sized industry towns in the US. We've also noticed it in other high-income countries. We've seen it in Britain, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in Spain and Portugal, and we're beginning to see it now in a set of emerging economies. Just to kind of clarify this for you, what you see on the left is the actual decline in manufacturing employment across regional economies in the US. And what you see on the right is the predicted decline in manufacturing employment due to import competition from China. The two line up very well. They don't line up perfectly. Globalization is not the only thing behind job loss in manufacturing in the US. Technological change has certainly contributed, but globalization has been a major factor behind why manufacturing jobs for the non-college educated are now much harder to obtain. So what I want to then briefly do before we start to think about solutions is to characterize for you the more general finding that this experience I've relayed about the consequences of import competition and globalization and the experiences of places like Martinsville are not unique. We've seen a more generalized phenomenon across places that have been specialized in traditional industries. Perhaps most notable among these is what's happened in places that are specialized in fossil fuels, with the decline in coal production having been the most notable. So if we think back over the last 4 or 5 decades, coal mining was the lifeblood of a bunch of towns in the Appalachian region of the United States. Coal mining, like manufacturing, paid high annual salaries to workers who hadn't obtained a BA degree. Employment in the sector peaked in 1980 after a great run in the 1970s due to 2 major global oil crises, which pushed oil prices up. That meant skyrocketing coal prices and strong demand for coal miners. What happened over the next 4 decades was a steady erosion of employment in coal. Today, employment in the sector is only 15% of what it was in 1980. What we observed in places that were specialized in coal production was something very similar to what we see in places that experience manufacturing job loss due to globalization. One was a decline in employment rates. Workers, as they saw their livelihoods diminish, responded in part, again, not by leaving and looking for work elsewhere, but by confronting the absence of opportunity, in part by just leaving the labor force in its entirety. And that was associated with, along with that came and reflected a decline in earnings. So as we now kind of transition to think about policy, looking backwards at these experiences, as we look across regions in which we've seen job loss due to either the decline of manufacturing, the decline of coal, or what's occurring right now, the decline across a broader set of industries that are dependent on fossil fuels, we want to think about what has the government done, what can the government do? Here, the differences between the United States and Europe start to become much more important. And here, the differences between what happens in higher income countries and middle income countries also become more important. In the US, what we've done over the past few decades is dismantle in part the social safety net. What that meant is that as job loss was occurring in the 90s and 2000s, you had weaker social insurance systems there to help take care of workers. So what we see is if you look across government programs that support individuals who are on hard times, the only programs that have been activated by job loss in regions are those tied to Social Security and Medicare. That is, government benefits you receive only by virtue of retiring and leaving the labor force. If we look at income assistance to low-income households, whether this is in the form of subsidized health care, that's the Medicaid program in the United States, or other programs such as food stamps or temporary assistance to needy families, these programs showed almost no response to localized job loss. That was due in part to the fact that the states in which these jobs were being lost are ones that have massively cut back on their social welfare spending. As a result, the only way someone could be eligible for substantial benefits from the government was by being in a position to be able to retire. And outside of retirement benefits, government support for those with lost jobs was quite minimal. So what do we do about this? We have a social welfare system in the United States which seems poorly designed to deal with the ongoing challenge of concentrated job loss and endemic joblessness. And we have then the resulting challenge of once regions have undergone this transition from being places with high-wage jobs for the non-college educated and traditional industries to being places bereft of those industries and economic opportunity, what do we think about possible paths forward? So we can kind of broadly frame the policy options in three different buckets. One is just to let market forces work. Ultimately, markets will equilibrate. If in the absence of geographic labor mobility, however, that adjustment may take decades. This is the approach, in effect, we've seen in lots of places to date. In the absence of much of a government response, we've let market forces do their thing because workers aren't leaving places in distress. The consequence has been this widening economic divides between places. A second approach is to focus on treating disadvantaged workers. That is, trying to get workers into new jobs. We've already seen that, at least in terms of means-tested entitlement programs in the United States. These programs aren't very effective. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about examples in the European context, in particular in Denmark, about how one can use social welfare programs more effectively. Working against the approach of treating disadvantaged workers, moving workers to jobs, is this issue of the absence of labor mobility, which we've already highlighted. A third approach is, instead of focusing on workers, to focus on regions. That is, to adopt place-based policies. This involves, and rather than moving workers to jobs, moving jobs to workers. What we've seen in the last couple of decades is a dramatic increase in the practice of local economic development in higher income countries. Some of this is supported by federal government programs. A lot of it is the consequence of experimentation on the ground. And so what I want to talk to you about next is, what do we know about this experimentation and what promise might it have for thinking about the way in which we close regional economic divides? First, because I'm an economist, I have to think about what are the underlying economic justifications of things like place-based policies. One justification is that we have what you can think of as an over-concentration of the most educated and highest income workers in superstar cities. That concentration is the result of a varied set of externalities in production, of spillovers between high-skilled workers when they concentrate in a particular place. The simple story is that productivity rises as the most innovative firms and the most productive workers locate in proximity to each other. The consequence, though, is rising housing prices, which keep out less educated workers and prevent them from taking advantage of the employment opportunities that exist in those superstar cities. The optimal policy here, at least in theory, is to think about a way of moving skilled workers or firms to these smaller markets. A second justification for these place-based policies comes not so much from economics as it does from the literature in sociology, and was inspired in large part by William Julius Wilson, who was for many years a faculty member of the Kennedy School. So what Wilson's work showed is that when you have poorly paid work in abundance in a place, there are negative social consequences. Workers either don't accumulate human capital or watch their skills degrade. You have absence of investment in public infrastructure. Children are raised in poverty, and so you get the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. The optimal policy here is kind of more or less the same as the optimal policy in response to clustering. That is to try and add good jobs in places where good jobs don't exist. So as we kind of take a step back and think about the evidence on place-based policy, the evidence is limited, but the evidence that does exist tells us that success is by no means guaranteed. There are some important examples of success. Perhaps the most significant is something that the US undertook 90 years ago in the Appalachian region with the launching of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which involved massive investment in roads, canals, power plants, and schools, which helped counties in the impoverished part of the United States in the Appalachian Mountain region industrialize. Also promising are the outcomes of active labor market policies in which training is provided to workers regarding skills that are in demand by industries expanding nationally. That sector-specific training is combined with services that help workers search for jobs, help them plot sensible career paths, and help them acquire the social skills they need to succeed on the job. Other successful examples come with the ability of some former industrial regions like Pittsburgh to, after losing much of its steel industry, to find a way of transitioning into a new set of tech industries by leveraging the educational institutions that it has and also a quite developed set of medical facilities. There are some prominent examples of failures, though, when we think about place-based policy. One common source of failure is that what policies do is simply benefit existing landowners. That is, you direct subsidies to a particular place that bids up land prices, and so all the gains are captured by those who already own property in a place to begin with. Another potential pitfall is political capture. That is, elected officials use the allocation of these resources not to help distressed regions, but to help their electoral prospects. And then we also have the possibility that what you end up with is a prisoner's dilemma. That is, zero-sum competition between places that are trying to compete for trophy firms. Perhaps the most egregious example of this comes from Kansas City in the United States, in an episode that's known as the Kansas City border war. So Kansas City sits on the boundary between two states, the states of Missouri and the state of Kansas. So the broader metropolitan area has two governors who are looking after it. What local policymakers did on the Missouri side of the border was to decide, well, we want to make Missouri better off, so we're going to offer tax inducements for companies on the Kansas side of the border to stay within Kansas City and just cross state lines. As folks in Kansas saw this going on, they said, not so fast, we're going to do the same thing in return. We're going to go and poach some of your companies. The consequence of this internecine battle was the movement of companies across the border within the same city, so by definition, doing nothing on net to help the region, but resulted in the two states spending a total of over $330 million on these inducements in the space of less than a decade. So if we think about place-based policies, this is sort of the poster example of what we don't want to do. What are examples of what we do want to do? So one comes from Grand Rapids, Michigan. So Grand Rapids, like Martinsville, Virginia, was historically specialized in furniture. As it saw furniture production progressively move to low-wage countries and leading to lower prices, creating just an existential threat to industries in the region, the owners of those companies got together with city government and said, we've got to do something about this. What they did was to create a public-private partnership called The Right Place, funded mostly with private money and a bit of government money. What The Right Place does is try and coordinate business and government decisions in order to help Grand Rapids make a successful transition in a global economy that's rapidly changing. So what did this mean in terms of actual practice? So one thing The Right Place did was to become a service center for companies that were thinking about locating there or were thinking about expanding their operations. So that meant helping firms navigate the permission process in order to build a new facility, finding the right location in which to construct that facility, and then making sure you get access to the state and municipal resources that on paper you merit. More importantly, it meant coordinating investments in skill, in branding, and in research and development that were relevant for the region. So on the skills part, that meant working with local public universities to make sure that they were offering degrees both at the community college level and the university level that would provide the skilled labor that businesses want, that then open opportunities, expand opportunities for employment among the non-college educated. So when we think about that optimal policy response in the presence of clustering and spillovers, you want to bring in skilled labor. So bringing in skilled labor is actually a way to explain employment opportunities for those with less education. It meant trying to develop international business opportunities by branding Grand Rapids and trying to pitch it as a place that multinational companies wanted to locate. And it meant also subsidizing some research and development opportunities as companies in the region tried to figure out how they move into advanced manufacturing to deal with a competitive threat from much lower income places. Grand Rapids pulled it off. Today, it remains a vibrant furniture manufacturing hub, producing in the higher end of the market. So our goal then in thinking about helping distressed regions turn themselves around involves trying to help regions develop organizations like The Right Place and help regions avoid the sort of destructive zero-sum competition that occurred during the Kansas City border war. So what this means is learning from successes in policy practice when it comes to how to retain and recruit companies in a non-destructive way, how to provide the technical assistance that businesses need, how to develop skills in the workforce that are attractive to companies, and how to make the right sources of investment in infrastructure that enhance local productivity. What successful practice in these domains does is catalyze investment, which in the presence of externalities kind of puts regions on a different growth path. It helps supply public goods and related infrastructure, which elevate productivity of companies and workers in a place. It helps solve coordination problems as companies are deciding how they reposition themselves in a constantly changing market. And it helps compensate for the fact that decision-making authority, in particular in the United States, is highly fragmented. So the challenge that policymakers face in this domain is not so much kind of figuring out what to do. We've identified areas of policy practice and best practice in those domains. It's making sure this stuff happens on the ground. The challenge in the US context is that support from government sources for different areas of practice is highly fragmented. So this map or this slide shows you 4 different maps. In the upper left corner, it shows you what local labor markets actually look like in the United States when we define regional economies, where are they located. As you move down, it then plots economic development districts. These are as defined by the US Department of Commerce for providing technical assistance to business. If you move to the right, you then see regions as defined by the US Department of Labor for providing financial support for worker training through workforce development boards. And then you move up, you see opportunity zones, which are financed by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, which provide subsidies for investment in low-income communities. None of these geographies are the same. So even if conceptually and practically we figured out areas, we figured out some of the dimensions of best practice, the existing administrative structures work against getting that best practice into effect on the ground. We've been learning about this at the Kennedy School through a new project that Danny Roderick, my colleague here, and I are undertaking with support from the Hewlett Foundation. So this is one of the places where the humility comes in. We're learning from practitioners about things that work on the ground. And what we're trying to do is translate that into recommendations for how we enact policy in a sensible way at the state and federal level so we can put best practice into place in regions that are in distress. So to help contribute in this domain, we're doing 2 things. One is that we are assembling data on resource flows in all these different areas of policy practice. Money spent to recruit and retrain businesses, money spent on workforce development and by community colleges and public universities on vocational education, money spent to provide technical assistance to business, money spent to subsidize investment in low-income communities. And we're going to make this information available to the policy world so that we can understand are resources flowing to the right place, and to what extent is jurisdictional fragmentation or other constraints impeding that flow. What we'll then do next is understand in a more systematic way, beyond the useful case studies that we and many others have assembled so far, what are the combinations of policies that make sense, and what are the contexts in which those combinations matter? Local economic development can't be a one-size-fits-all thing. We know that economic distress is endemic. The causes of the distress vary across places. And so we need to know a lot more about what policy combinations are most sensible in this domain. And so a second part of our project, after assembling data on what's being supported where and in which particular areas of practice, will be to analyze systematically how the impacts of those policies vary according to local context. So to wrap up and kind of shift us towards a broader discussion, this regional concentrated joblessness is now a major issue of our time, a very important dimension of overall economic inequality is the absence of economic opportunity in many, many places. And we're now coming to terms with the fact that those disparities across regional economies have severe economic, social, and political consequences. On the positive side, what we're seeing is lots of experimentation at the local level in terms of figuring out how we help distressed regions right themselves. We need to do a lot more learning about the nature of these interventions, and so that we can conduct them at the scale that they need in order to address the regional economic disparities that have arisen. But I also want to be mindful of the fact that there's a lot we have left to learn. What we're doing at the Kennedy School is helping engage the community of practice in this area, learn from them, share what we know, and help advance practice in this important area. So with that, I think I'll stop my slide share and transition us over to some Q&A. I would be delighted to hear your thoughts, questions, and interjections.
Great, thanks, Gordon. And yeah, just a reminder, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do have a few questions to get us started, Gordon, and one kind of around education, and it's a little two-parter. So the first part being in developed countries like the US, does the increase in unemployment over the years, is that a result that human labor has been replaced by machines, or that college education is cardinal for one to qualify for employment? And does that mean that everyone in the near future should have a college education to secure jobs? And what does that mean for developing countries where that's a little bit more challenging?
Well, so we're coming to terms with the fact that that increasing college attainment is not going to be a significant part of the solution. And that's because we've sort of flatlined in terms of how many people we can get through college. Lots of people are starting college. The rates of college attendance have gone up, but the rates of college completion haven't changed much in the last 2 decades. And so in the US, at least, we're not going to get more than 35 or 40% of adults to a BA degree. So we need to be thinking about ways in which we can enhance the productivity of workers without a college degree and ways in which we can generate better jobs for those workers. So for emerging economies, what that means is they need to be mindful of the fact that as they increase college attainment, that's going to help. But again, the solution is not everyone getting a BA degree because it just doesn't seem practical.
Great, thank you, Gordon. Kind of another two-parter from one of our MPP alums. First being, could a decentralized place-based industrial policy at regional level be a solution? And do you have any thoughts on how to institutionalize experimentation at the local policy level?
Yeah, really, really interesting and important question. And let me give you kind of 3 different models in how place-based policy is being conducted. I've kind of highlighted some features of the US model. That is, the money, a lot of the money comes from the federal government, but the distribution of that money and the allocation of that money is locally controlled. There is a good side to this. Places like the Right Place in Grand Rapids, Michigan, are showing some very positive experimentation. So shutting down that experimentation by centralizing things would be a mistake. The downside of it is the fragmentation that I alluded to. We then jump to the European context. What we see is the polar opposite. Europe has centralized much of its place-based policy, not at the national level, but at the European Union level through its social cohesion policy, in which money is given to places by formula. So the good part about this is that you're dedicating funding to helping places in distress. The bad part about it is that you're not acknowledging the importance of local experimentation and the context specificity of the sort of policies that should be put into action. So what we want is something that balances those 2 extremes, centralize the provision of resources while avoiding fragmentation and encouraging and learning from local experimentation.
Great, thank you. So we have a few more questions that are coming in. Are the dislocations and disruptions most often associated with natural resource-based economies, like in coal or in forestry and papermaking?
So the fossil fuel-oriented industries have been disrupted, are being disrupted, and will continue to be disrupted. But it's not just them. It's traditional manufacturing, which is in which we've seen employment declines across high-income countries. Germany is even in Germany, which is the strongest manufacturing sector of any high-income country, we've seen declines in manufacturing as a share of total employment. It's now spreading beyond those sectors to things in the future if automated vehicles come into use into trucking. So what we have are those traditional industries that rewarded manual labor with high earnings are disappearing. And we need to then think about what are the sectors in which we're going to move those workers in which they can enjoy higher earnings. That's almost going to have to be in services.
Great. A few more. What approach could you suggest after we reach normalcy in COVID-19 towards economic recovery, especially for developing countries?
Yeah, COVID. So we were coming to terms with the nature of economic distress across places, and then COVID happens. And COVID, one, just increases human misery on a dramatic scale. But what it's also done is deplete government budgets in many places, and so you don't have the financial wherewithal to address the challenges that were there. So as we think about what to do next, it's important to recognize that some of these policy interventions are not big ticket items. When we think in particular about workforce development, what we know is that targeting jobs that employers want to hire in, so learning from employers about the skills they want and training disadvantaged workers in those skills is really important, as is helping disadvantaged workers acquire the social skills they need to succeed in the workplace. Now, in the US context, when I say disadvantaged worker, we mean somebody without a job. In a developing country context, what you often mean are workers in the informal sector. But there are very strong parallels between the two. Economic distress across communities in the developing country context manifests itself not in higher incidence of joblessness. It manifests itself in terms of higher rates of informality. The second set of interventions that are quite useful are improving management capabilities in companies. So we actually have now a good body of evidence in which through randomized control trials in which we provide free consulting. So making McKinsey consultants free to small and medium-sized businesses, and then see what happens. And what you see are dramatic improvements in productivity, in the adoption of innovations, and in the ability to break into export markets. It's not to say we want to subsidize McKinsey to help the developing world, but consulting done on a smaller scale and economically can be quite successful in helping companies get closer to the small and medium-sized companies get closer to the technology frontier.
Thanks. Somebody has a question about FDI, knowing that it's not a panacea for joblessness and inequality. Do you foresee the need for increased inward investment policies from local economic development practitioners as an important instrument to stimulate economic growth and close regional divides?
So foreign direct investment is a essential part of economic development in many places. What we know about big multinational companies is that when they come in, they pay higher wages than anybody else in the region. And they connect a place to global markets, and they bring in technology that's on the absolute frontier. So all of that is great. The problem for many places is that those companies like regions that are already succeeding, places that have the workers with the right sort of skills, places that have good infrastructure, places that are well connected to global markets. So being able to attract multinational companies is something that some places can't really aspire to right now, but it might be part of more of a medium run strategy.
Someone's also asking about our newish ability to work remotely and how that what influence that's had on your research in terms of seeing people moving out of large cities into more rural areas, and are there different approaches for different regions in proximity to large cities? So can the surrounding areas be the suppliers of food and other goods for the large cities? Does food manufacturing need to be increased in the US?
Yeah, work from home is just has a big question mark on it. What it's primarily taken the form of is not people leaving Manhattan and moving to Poughkeepsie or to upstate New York or to a goat farm in the Hudson Valley. It's primarily taken the form of moving from Manhattan to an outer suburb. So if in the end, that's what work from home looks like, just moving people out of expensive city centers and into cheaper outlying areas, it's not going to do a lot to promote economic development. Now, if instead we see more, we see an increase in the more distant relocation of workers in smaller towns, then it could be a big deal. But I would be really nervous about companies investing too much in that strategy. So far, what we've seen is that the places that have benefited from that more remote work from home strategy are places that were already succeeding. These are the Boise, Idahos, and these are the Salt Lake Cities, and these are places that were already attractive.
Okay, we're going to do two more questions. Mario mentioned the Pittsburgh case, sounding easier said than done, and asked if you could explain in more detail how to shift to more reliance in academic institutions.
Yes, there's lots of debate about the Pittsburgh case. So Pittsburgh became a major global producer of steel in the early part of the 20th century. It benefited from the fact that it was close to where there was iron ore and it was close to where there was coal, and that's what you need to make the giant blast furnaces that used to dominate the industry work. As technology changed and as steel production moved overseas, Pittsburgh went into a multi-decade decline. That decline wasn't reversed. Pittsburgh today is smaller than it was in 1950 or 1960. What Pittsburgh has succeeded in doing is staunching the decline by leveraging the fact that the existing industries that were there built a set of public institutions which helped in its ultimate revival. And that is universities like Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh, arts facilities, which are attractive if you want to bring tech workers in, good architectural bones in downtown Pittsburgh, and then the medical facilities that were developed in part allied with universities. You think about Boston's Renaissance, something similar happened here. It happened more easily and more quickly than happened in Pittsburgh. Not to say Boston didn't have some tough decades in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I don't want to read too much into those examples, however, because Boston and Pittsburgh were placed with world-class universities. Most places don't have world-class universities, and you have to think about a strategy that leverages the institutions of higher education that you have, which are more likely could be a regional public university or just a community college.
Great. Okay, and one final question. You had talked about Denmark's social welfare and the utilization by disadvantaged workers. Can you touch a little bit more on that?
So everybody, when it comes to labor economists, everybody loves Denmark, or almost everybody loves Denmark. So what Denmark does is it has rules governing employment that are very similar to what you see, say, in the US or the UK. That is, it's pretty easy to fire workers. And that makes labor markets more flexible than they would be in, say, France or Germany or Italy. At the same time, what Denmark does is provide very generous unemployment insurance. So you're taken care of if you lose your job, and really good active labor market programs which help you shift into new lines of work and acquire the skills that you need to do so. So even though Denmark has this really generous unemployment insurance, unemployment rates in Denmark are much lower than they are in the rest of the EU because its workforce development policies help labor pivot into new activities quite effectively. What I think is really important about the Danish case is it's something that's done at the national level. Denmark's not a big country, but still it shows that we can scale this approach for helping workers who've lost their jobs find gainful new activities.
I actually had one more good question come in, so I'm going to feed it to you, Gordon. What impact does the social condition of an area make in determining the potential success of economic development, investment, or initiative? And is it worth making investments in healthy social development at the same time that we invest in business growth?
Yeah, boy, the social conditions and health conditions can be a real impediment to attracting industry. You don't want to go into a place in which people and which mortality rates are high and rates of morbidity, comorbidities are abundant. And so improving social conditions in a place can really complement the attractiveness to investment.